The sun hung low in the evening sky, painting the cracked asphalt of Highway 67 in shades of amber and gold. At the edge of this forgotten stretch of road stood Murphy's gas station, a weathered relic that most travelers passed without a second glance. Its neon signs flickered weakly against the approaching dusk, casting ghostly shadows across the empty lot. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the promise of a storm that never quite arrived. John Cena pulled his black SUV into the station, the engine's rumble breaking the evening silence. He stepped out, his massive frame moving with the casual confidence of a man who had faced crowds of thousands, but still appreciated quiet moments like this. The gas station attendant behind the dusty window gave him a polite wave, which John returned with a friendly nod. He wasn't here to be recognized or celebrated. He just needed fuel for the long drive ahead. Near the station's entrance, two police officers stood beside their patrol car, their voices carrying across the lot with an edge that cut through the peaceful evening. The taller officer, Sergeant Rick Morrison, leaned against his cruiser with the swagger of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. His partner, Officer Danny Pierce, was smaller but carried himself with the same arrogant energy. Both men were technically off duty, yet they wore their uniforms like armor, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Their conversation was loud, punctuated by harsh laughter that seemed to mock the very air around them. They spoke about their shift, about the trash they had to deal with, about how some people just didn't know their place anymore. Their words dripped with the kind of casual cruelty that festers in dark corners, growing bolder when it thinks nobody important is listening. John focused on filling his tank, the mechanical click of the pump providing a steady rhythm against the officer's increasingly aggressive banter. Something about their tone made his jaw tighten slightly, but he had learned long ago to pick his battles carefully. Still, there was something in the air that felt wrong, like the moments before lightning strikes. From the edge of the property, a figure began to approach. At first, he was just a silhouette against the fading light, moving with careful, measured steps. As he drew closer, details emerged that painted a picture of quiet dignity and hard-earned honor. The man was elderly, his dark skin weathered by decades of sun and service. He wore a navy blue jacket that had seen better days, but it was clean and pressed with military precision. What commanded immediate respect, however, were the patches and medals adorning his chest. Silver stars, bronze service medals, campaign ribbons, each one representing moments of courage that most people could never imagine. His name tag read M. Rivers, and below it, the faded text, U.S. Army Retired. In his right hand, he carried a white cane that tapped rhythmically against the pavement, a steady beat that announced his approach. Master Sergeant Malcolm Rivers walked with the bearing of a soldier, despite the clouded eyes that revealed his blindness. He had lost his sight in an explosion during his final tour, a sacrifice made in service to a country that had not always served him in return. But Malcolm carried no bitterness in his posture, only the quiet strength of a man who had faced hell and walked out with his honor intact. As Malcolm reached the edge of the gas station lot, he paused, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the sounds around him. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant traffic on the highway, the voices of the two officers. He cataloged each sound, using them to map the world he could no longer see. His keen hearing, sharpened by years of navigating without sight, picked up the undertone of aggression in the officers' conversation. John watched this approach with growing interest. There was something about the elderly veteran that commanded attention, not the desperate plea for help that some might expect from a blind man, but the quiet authority of someone who had earned his place in the world through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The medals on his chest weren't decorations. They were proof of a life lived in service to others. The gas pump clicked to a stop, but John barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Malcolm had stopped near the two officers, his cane resting against the ground as he turned in their direction. The evening air seemed to grow thicker, charged with the kind of tension that precedes moments that change everything. Malcolm's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and respectful. "Excuse me, officers," he said, his tone carrying the measured courtesy of a man raised to respect authority. "Could one of you gentlemen help me cross the road? I seem to have lost my way a bit." The request was simple, the kind that any decent person would fulfill without question. But as the words left Malcolm's lips, something shifted in the atmosphere. The officer's conversation stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt dangerous. John's hand froze on the gas pump handle, every instinct he possessed suddenly alert. What happened next would transform a quiet evening at a forgotten gas station into a moment that would ripple across the nation, exposing the ugly reality that still lurked beneath the surface of American society, and proving that sometimes, when evil shows its face, a hero stands nearby. The silence that followed Malcolm's polite request seemed to stretch endlessly, like the moment before a dam bursts. Officer Pierce was the first to break it with a sound that sent chills down John's spine, a low, mocking chuckle that held no warmth or humanity. "Lost your way," Pierce said, his voice dripping with disdain. He pushed himself off the patrol car and took a step toward Malcolm, his posture shifting from casual indifference to predatory interest. "Sounds like you've lost a lot more than that, old man." Sergeant Morrison joined in with his own cruel laughter, the sound echoing off the gas station walls like the bark of wild dogs circling wounded prey. "This ain't a crosswalk, Gramps," Morrison sneered, taking a long sip from his coffee cup as if savoring both the drink and the moment. "Maybe you should stick to places meant for folks like you." John's grip tightened on the gas pump handle, his knuckles whitening as he watched the scene unfold. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, that these men who had sworn to serve and protect were instead choosing to humiliate and intimidate. But Malcolm, incredibly, remained perfectly still, his face showing no reaction to their taunts. "I only need assistance for a few steps," Malcolm said, his voice maintaining its respectful tone despite the officer's hostility. "Then I'll be on my way." The veteran's composure seemed to irritate Morrison even more. Here was a man who refused to be cowed, who maintained his dignity in the face of their cruelty, and it infuriated the corrupt officer. Morrison's face darkened as he pushed off from the car and walked toward Malcolm with slow, deliberate steps that spoke of barely contained violence. "You got ears, don't you?" Morrison snarled, stopping just inches from Malcolm's face. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes wafted from his breath as he leaned in closer. "We said no." What happened next occurred so quickly that it seemed to unfold in slow motion. With a swift, vicious motion, Morrison slapped the white cane from Malcolm's hand. The hollow clatter of the cane hitting the concrete echoed across the lot like a gunshot, the sound seeming to reverberate through John's very soul. Malcolm didn't cry out. He didn't stumble or fall. He simply stood there, his arms at his sides, his mouth pressed into a thin line of controlled restraint. The dignity he maintained in that moment was more powerful than any angry response could have been. Here was a man who had faced enemy fire, who had bled for his country, being humiliated by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Pierce found the scene hilarious, his laughter growing louder and more obnoxious. "Oops," he said, his voice filled with mock innocence. "Butterfingers." "Please," Malcolm said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that spoke of decades of similar humiliations endured with grace. "Just return my cane." Morrison stepped closer, invading Malcolm's personal space with the confidence of a predator who believed himself untouchable. "Return it," he said, his voice rising with each word. "Why don't you crawl around and find it yourself, huh? You think just because you've got a few shiny medals on your chest, people are supposed to kiss your boots?" The words hit John like physical blows. These men weren't just being cruel. They were attacking everything Malcolm represented. They were spitting on his service, mocking his sacrifice, treating a war hero like garbage simply because they could. John's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to intervene immediately, knowing that the wrong move could escalate the situation beyond control. Pierce, emboldened by his partner's aggression, decided to add his own contribution to the nightmare unfolding before them. "Look at you," he said, circling Malcolm like a shark. "Can't see, can't fight. What good are you now, hero?" The mockery in his voice was absolute, designed to strip away every shred of Malcolm's dignity. But the veteran remained standing, his posture straight, his face calm despite the storm of hatred swirling around him. He had faced worse than these two cowards, and he would not give them the satisfaction of breaking him. That's when Pierce made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Without warning, without provocation, he drew back his hand and delivered a sharp, open-handed slap across Malcolm's face. The sound cracked through the evening air like a whip, sharp and unforgivable. Malcolm's head jerked to the side from the impact, and for a moment, he swayed slightly on his feet. But he didn't fall. He didn't cry out. He didn't even raise his hands to his face. He simply absorbed the blow with the same quiet strength he had shown throughout the entire encounter, his face reddening from the strike, but his spirit unbroken. The slap had been the final straw for John Cena. Every instinct he possessed as a protector, every value he held dear, every principle that had guided his life suddenly crystallized into pure, focused rage. He dropped the gas pump handle, the metallic clang as it hit the concrete, seeming to announce his entry into the battle. His boots crunched across the gravel with the sound of thunder rolling across the earth. Each step was heavy, purposeful, carrying the weight of a man who had finally seen enough injustice to last a lifetime. The officers were so focused on their victim that they didn't notice the storm approaching until it was almost upon them. "Hey!" John's voice boomed across the lot with unmistakable authority, the single word carrying more power than all of the officers' cruel taunts combined. It was the voice of a man who had commanded the attention of millions, now focused like a laser beam on two cowards who were about to learn what real strength looked like. Both officers turned, their faces showing initial surprise that quickly morphed into recognition and then uncertainty. They had been so focused on their helpless victim that they hadn't noticed they had attracted the attention of someone who wouldn't be intimidated, who wouldn't look away, and who sure as hell wouldn't let them continue their assault unopposed. The quiet evening at the forgotten gas station was about to become very loud indeed. The moment John's voice cut through the evening air, everything changed. The two officers spun around, their faces shifting from cruel amusement to shock as they recognized the massive figure striding toward them. But John wasn't looking at them, not yet. His attention was focused entirely on Malcolm, who stood with quiet dignity despite the red mark blooming across his cheek. John reached Malcolm's side in 3 powerful strides, his presence immediately creating a protective barrier between the veteran and his tormentors. He knelt down and carefully picked up the fallen cane, brushing the dust and gravel from its white surface with gentle reverence. When he placed it back in Malcolm's withered hand, their fingers touched briefly, and Malcolm felt the strength and solidarity flowing from this unexpected ally. "You're done," John said, turning to face the officers. His voice was calm but carried the unmistakable edge of controlled fury. "Step away from him." Now, Officer Pierce, trying to recover from his initial shock, puffed out his chest in a pathetic display of false bravado. "And you are?" he asked, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. The presence of this imposing figure had clearly rattled him more than he wanted to admit. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he positioned himself more firmly between Malcolm and the two officers, his massive frame creating an impenetrable wall. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, each one delivered with the precision of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," John said evenly, "especially bullies who hide behind badges." Sergeant Morrison, unwilling to lose face in front of his partner, took a step forward. His hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by John, whose own military training had taught him to recognize such threats instantly. "You serious right now?" Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "You're going to lecture 2 cops." "Cops?" John's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. "No, real cops protect people. You're just bullies in uniform." The words hit their mark like precision strikes. Morrison's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. He had built his entire identity around the authority his badge supposedly gave him, and here was someone stripping that authority away with simple, undeniable truth. "Big talk," Morrison snarled, trying to recover his earlier swagger. "You think just because you're famous, we're going to—" John stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they stood nose to nose. The height difference was minimal, but the presence difference was enormous. Morrison suddenly felt very small, very exposed, and very aware that his badge meant nothing to the man standing before him. "I don't care who you think you are," John said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. "You put your hands on him again, and you'll find out exactly who I am." The threat wasn't empty, and both officers knew it. John's reputation as a fighter preceded him, but more than that, his reputation as a man of principle was legendary. This wasn't just about physical intimidation. This was about moral authority, and John held all of it in this moment. Behind them, a small crowd had begun to form. The gas station attendant had stepped outside, drawn by the commotion. A couple of other customers, who had been filling their tanks, had moved closer, phones already out and recording. The isolated incident was rapidly becoming a very public confrontation. Pierce, seeing the growing audience, tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. "Look, there's no problem here," he said, his voice now taking on a conciliatory tone. "We were just having a conversation with—" "A conversation?" John interrupted, his voice filled with disgust. "You slapped a blind veteran across the face. You knocked his cane out of his hand. You humiliated a man who served this country for 30 years. That's not a conversation, that's assault." Malcolm, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried clearly across the lot. "I didn't need a hero," he said, his words directed at no one in particular. "But I'm grateful one showed up." The simple dignity of his statement hit everyone present like a physical force. Here was a man who had been brutalized and humiliated, and he was still speaking with grace and gratitude. The contrast between his nobility and the officer's cruelty was stark and undeniable. John glanced over his shoulder at Malcolm, and their eyes met for a brief moment. In that instant, an understanding passed between them. Two men from different worlds, bound together by a shared commitment to doing what was right. "You've had enough people turn away," John said to Malcolm, though his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not this time." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone in the crowd had called for backup, though whether it was to help the officers or to investigate them remained unclear. Red and blue lights began to flicker on the horizon, painting the evening sky with urgent colors. Morrison and Pierce exchanged nervous glances. The situation was spiraling completely out of their control. What had started as a private moment of cruelty was now a public spectacle, with cameras rolling and backup approaching. Their casual abuse of power was about to become very expensive. "Is there a problem here?" called out a new voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see a bystander holding up his phone, the red recording light clearly visible. "Because it looks like these officers just assaulted an elderly veteran." Pierce cursed under his breath, the full reality of their situation finally sinking in. In the age of social media and viral videos, their actions would be dissected and judged by millions. Their careers, their reputations, their entire lives were about to change forever. John didn't move from his protective position in front of Malcolm. "You still want to hit someone?" he asked Morrison, his voice carrying a challenge that the corrupt sergeant clearly didn't have the courage to accept. "Or are you ready to apologize?" Morrison's fist clenched at his side, but he didn't move. The arrival of backup was imminent, the crowd was growing, and the cameras were rolling. Any further violence would be career suicide, and despite his many flaws, he wasn't completely stupid. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights now clearly visible as two patrol cars approached the gas station at high speed. The evening that had started so quietly was about to explode into chaos, with John Cena standing as an immovable barrier between justice and injustice, between a hero and those who would destroy him. As the backup units pulled into the lot, one thing was clear. This confrontation was far from over. But Malcolm Rivers, the blind veteran who had been attacked simply for asking for help, now had a protector who wouldn't back down. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The first police cruiser screeched to a halt at the edge of the gas station lot, its red and blue lights casting dancing shadows across the tense scene. The second unit followed immediately behind, and from both vehicles emerged officers who carried themselves with the professional bearing that Morrison and Pierce had long since abandoned. Sergeant Elena Rose stepped out of the lead car, her silver-streaked hair tucked neatly under her cap, her gray eyes immediately scanning the situation with the practiced assessment of a 20-year veteran. Behind her, Officer Martinez activated his body camera, the small red light beginning to blink as it documented everything that would follow. The contrast between the arriving officers and the two who had assaulted Malcolm was immediately apparent. Rose carried herself with quiet authority, her uniform pristine, her bearing respectful. When she spoke, her voice was calm but commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her gaze moving from Morrison and Pierce to John and Malcolm, then to the growing crowd of witnesses who had their phones out and recording. Before either of the accused officers could respond, the gas station attendant hurried forward, his voice shaking with indignation. "Those two," he pointed directly at Morrison and Pierce, "they attacked that man. He was just asking for help crossing the road, and they knocked his cane down and hit him. This gentleman," he gestured toward John, "he's the only reason it didn't get worse." Rose's expression darkened as she processed the information. Her eyes moved to Malcolm, taking in his military jacket, his service medals, the red mark still visible on his cheek. Then she looked at Morrison and Pierce, both of whom were suddenly unable to meet her gaze. "Sir," she said, addressing Malcolm directly, her voice respectful and professional, "can you tell me what happened?" Malcolm straightened slightly, his military bearing evident even in this moment of vulnerability. "I asked these officers to help me cross the road," he said, his voice steady despite everything he had endured. "They laughed, knocked my cane from my hand, and one of them struck me across the face." "Did you threaten them in any way?" Rose asked, though the question seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. "No, ma'am," Malcolm replied with quiet dignity. "I served this country for 30 years. I don't strike first." Rose's jaw tightened as she processed his words. She had seen enough in her career to recognize truth when she heard it, and Malcolm's account had the ring of absolute honesty. She turned her attention to Morrison and Pierce, her expression now cold with professional anger. "Hand over your badges and weapons," she commanded. "Now." Morrison exploded in indignation. "What? You're taking his word over ours? We're police officers." "No," Rose replied with icy calm. "You were police officers. And I'm not just taking his word. I'm taking the word of multiple witnesses, the security camera footage." She pointed to the station surveillance system, "and your own body microphones, which I assume were recording during your entire encounter." The color drained from Pierce's face as he realized the full implications of their situation. In their arrogance and casual cruelty, they had forgotten about the very technology that was supposed to protect them. Now it would be used to destroy them. Rose extended her hand expectantly. "Badges and weapons. I won't ask again." Reluctantly, Morrison unclipped his badge and removed his service weapon, handing them over with barely contained rage. Pierce followed suit, muttering curses under his breath that only served to further demonstrate his complete lack of professionalism. John, who had remained protective of Malcolm throughout the exchange, now found himself being addressed by Sergeant Rose. "Mr. Cena," she said, clearly recognizing him, "I appreciate your intervention, but I need to get a full statement from you. Can I ask you to remain here?" "Of course," John replied without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." As Rose began coordinating with her officers to process the scene, John turned his attention back to Malcolm. The elderly veteran was standing with remarkable composure, considering what he had just endured, but John could see the subtle signs of strain in his posture. "Are you hurt?" John asked gently. Malcolm touched his cheek lightly, where Pierce had struck him. "Not badly," he said. "I've taken worse." The simple statement carried more weight than volumes of complaint could have. Here was a man who had survived combat, who had lost his sight in service to his country, and who was treating this assault as just another challenge to endure with grace. "You didn't have to step in," Malcolm said, turning his head slightly toward John. "But I'm glad you did." "Someone had to," John replied. "What they did was wrong." Malcolm nodded slowly, his fingers adjusting his grip on his cane. "People have been turning a blind eye for too long," he said with quiet irony. Just because I can't see doesn't mean I can't feel it when it happens. Their conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Rowe's return. Sir, she addressed Malcolm, we'd like to have paramedics check you over, just to be safe. I'm all right, Malcolm said. I just want to go home. Rowe nodded understandingly. We'll arrange transportation for you unless... She looked at John questioningly. I can take him, John offered immediately. Malcolm considered for a moment, then gave a slight nod of acceptance. That would be fine. As the scene continued to unfold around them, with Morrison and Pierce being processed for assault and civil rights violations, witnesses giving statements, and reporters already beginning to arrive, John helped Malcolm toward his SUV. The evening air had grown cooler, and the gas station lot that had been nearly empty when John first arrived was now bustling with activity. The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a quiet stop for fuel had become the epicenter of a story that would soon spread across the nation. The video footage captured by bystanders was already being uploaded to social media, where it would be viewed millions of times and spark conversations about police brutality, veteran rights, and the power of standing up for what's right. As John helped Malcolm into the passenger seat of his SUV, adjusting the seatbelt carefully and placing the veteran's cane within easy reach, he realized that this night would stay with him forever. Not because of the publicity it would generate or the praise he would receive, but because he had witnessed something profound, the unbreakable dignity of a man who had given everything for his country and refused to be broken by those who would abuse their power. The sirens were beginning to fade as the immediate crisis passed, but the impact of what had happened would reverberate far beyond this forgotten gas station on a quiet highway. Justice had arrived, but more importantly, it had been served by ordinary people who refused to stand by and watch evil triumph. The drive through the darkening countryside was quiet at first, filled only with the gentle hum of the SUV's engine and the soft whisper of tires on asphalt. John kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his attention was focused on the man sitting beside him. Malcolm sat with his hands folded over his cane, his military bearing evident even in the passenger seat of a stranger's vehicle. The silence between them wasn't awkward or forced. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people have shared something profound and are still processing its meaning. Through the windows, the lights of small towns flickered past like distant stars, each one representing lives that would soon be touched by the story of what had happened at that gas station. You know, Malcolm finally said, his voice soft but clear, it's not the first time someone's laid hands on me just because of how I look or what they think I represent, but it was the first time in a long while that someone stood in the way. John's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I didn't even think about it, he replied honestly. I just saw something wrong and acted. Malcolm turned his head toward John, though his clouded eyes couldn't see the man who had become his protector. That's rare, he said. Most people, they freeze up when they see injustice. They look away, or they convince themselves it's not their fight. Well, John said, glancing sideways at his passenger, maybe they should start realizing it is their fight. A small smile crossed Malcolm's weathered face. Maybe so. They drove in companionable silence for a few more miles before Malcolm spoke again, this time sharing pieces of his story that the evening's chaos had prevented him from telling. I served 30 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of those decades. Lost my sight in a blast during my final tour. Came home and learned that some people don't care what you gave up for them. They only see your skin, or your disability, or just someone they think they can push around. John's jaw clenched as he absorbed the injustice of it all. It's disgusting, he said. It's life. Malcolm replied with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had learned to survive in an imperfect world. But tonight reminded me that not everyone is like those two. As they entered Malcolm's neighborhood, the veteran gave quiet directions to a modest single-story house with a small American flag hanging from a post on the front porch. The flag moved gently in the evening breeze, a symbol of the country Malcolm had served with such distinction and the ideals that men like Morrison and Pierce had betrayed. John parked the SUV and got out, circling around to help Malcolm from the passenger seat. The veteran accepted the assistance with dignity, straightening his jacket and adjusting his grip on his cane once he was standing. "I'll be all right from here," Malcolm said, but John could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I can walk you up," John offered. Malcolm paused, considering. "I'd like that," he said finally. They walked slowly up the path together, John matching his pace to Malcolm's careful steps. The porch light cast a warm glow over them as they approached the front door, and in that light, John could see the full impact of what Malcolm had endured, not just tonight, but throughout his life of service and sacrifice. "You didn't ask my name," Malcolm observed as they reached the door. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," John replied. Malcolm nodded with approval. "Malcolm Rivers, Master Sergeant, retired." "John Cena," John said, though they both knew Malcolm had recognized his voice long ago. "I know," Malcolm said with a slight smile. "And now I won't forget it." Malcolm unlocked his door and stood in the frame for a moment longer, not quite ready to end this encounter that had changed both their lives. "You reminded me tonight," he said, "that there's still honor in the world." "And you reminded me," John replied, "what real courage looks like." They stood there for a few seconds more, two men from different worlds who had been brought together by circumstance and bound together by shared values. Then Malcolm stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and John walked back to his SUV. As John drove through the quiet streets toward home, his phone began buzzing with notifications. The video footage from the gas station was already going viral, spreading across social media platforms at lightning speed. News outlets were picking up the story, civil rights organizations were issuing statements, and celebrities were sharing their support for Malcolm and praise for John's intervention. By morning, the story would be everywhere. "Wrestling star saves blind veteran from police harassment," read one headline. "John Cena confronts corrupt cops in viral gas station video," proclaimed another. The footage, shaky but clear, showed the entire confrontation, the officers mocking Malcolm, knocking away his cane, the shocking slap across his face, and then John emerging like a force of nature to protect the defenseless veteran. But John barely noticed the media frenzy building around him. His thoughts were focused on Malcolm, on the quiet dignity the man had shown in the face of such cruelty, and on the responsibility that came with being in a position to help others. The next morning brought consequences swift and severe. Morrison and Pierce were formally charged with assault and civil rights violations. The police department launched a full internal investigation, and their chief held a press conference denouncing their actions and promising reforms. Sergeant Rowe became the face of law enforcement's commitment to justice, her handling of the situation earning praise from community leaders and civil rights activists alike. Malcolm, meanwhile, found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Reporters wanted interviews, veterans organizations wanted to honor him, and politicians wanted to use his story for their own purposes. But Malcolm handled it all with the same grace he had shown that night at the gas station, speaking softly about service, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The gas station where it all happened became an unlikely pilgrimage site. People left flowers by the pump where the confrontation occurred. Small American flags appeared in the surrounding soil, and someone placed a framed photo of Malcolm in his military uniform under a protective plastic sheet. The cashier who had witnessed everything said the entire atmosphere around the place had changed. Customers treated each other differently, with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't existed before. John, true to his character, declined most interview requests but issued a simple statement. "This wasn't about me. It was about standing up when something's wrong. Anyone should have done it. I just happened to be there." But the impact of that night extended far beyond the headlines and social media posts. In schools across the country, teachers used the video as part of discussions about courage and civic duty. Young people who watched it began to understand that heroism isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to look away when someone needs help. The story became a turning point, a moment when ordinary people were reminded that they had the power to make a difference. It showed that justice doesn't always come from institutions or authorities. Sometimes it comes from individuals who decide that enough is enough. And in a modest house, with a flag on the porch, Malcolm Rivers sat quietly in his living room, listening to the news reports about the night that changed everything. He touched the medal that John had insisted he keep, a small token of respect between two men who understood that true strength comes not from power or fame, but from the courage to do what's right when it matters most. The world had watched, the world had learned, and perhaps most importantly, the world had been reminded that heroes still exist. They just don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear military jackets with faded medals, and sometimes they drive SUVs and stop for gas at forgotten stations on quiet highways. The story wasn't over. It never really would be. But what mattered was that people had seen, they had witnessed, and they had been moved to action. In a world too often filled with indifference and cruelty, one act of courage had reminded everyone what was possible when good people refused to remain silent. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.